June 25, 1876. The heat was unbearable, the kind that clung to the skin like a second layer, suffocating, relentless. Overhead, the Montana sky stretched vast and cloudless, an unbroken sea of pale blue. A lone raven circled high above the ridgeline, its shadow flickering over the dry earth below. Beneath it, the men of the 7th Cavalry rode in weary silence, their faces sunburnt, their lips cracked from days of hard riding with little rest. Their boots were caked in dust, their horses sluggish beneath them. The river shimmered in the distance, but there was no time to stop. Not now. George Armstrong Custer sat tall in the saddle at the head of the column, golden curls spilling from beneath his wide-brimmed hat, his blue cavalry jacket unbuttoned against the heat. His gaze swept the land ahead, sharp and searching. He could feel it, though he would never admit it. Something was wrong. His scouts had warned him. Mitch Boyer, his half-French, half-Crow guide, had pleaded with him just hours earlier. "There are too many," Boyer had said, voice tight with urgency. "The valley is filled with them. More than we thought." Custer had scoffed. "We've fought these warriors before. They'll scatter when they see us." Boyer had only shaken his head, but he had said no more. Custer had made his decision. He had divided his regiment into 3 columns, sending Major Reno and Captain Benteen on separate flanks. They would strike the village from different directions, catch the Sioux and Cheyenne by surprise. It was a plan built on speed, aggression, on certainty that the enemy would flee before them. But as they crested a low ridge, that certainty began to waver. Ahead, the valley stretched wide, the little Bighorn River winding like a silver ribbon through the tall grass. And beyond it, the village. Not a scattering of teepees, not a small winter encampment, but a sprawling city of canvas and hide. It stretched farther than the eye could see, smoke curling from hundreds of cooking fires, the air thick with the distant sound of voices, of children laughing, of horses whinnying. It was alive, thriving, strong. And then movement. A ripple through the village, like wind sweeping through prairie grass. A moment of stillness, then an eruption of motion. Warriors streamed from the teepees, leaping onto waiting ponies, streaking toward the river in a wave of color and sound. It was not panic. It was not fear. They were not running. They were coming. A tremor ran through the column. The soldiers shifted in their saddles, fingers tightening around rifle stocks. Some glanced at each other, their faces pale beneath the dust. They had expected an easy fight, the same way it had always been. But this was different. This was something else. Custer turned in his saddle, calling to his officers, his voice steady, commanding. "We hold the ridge. Form a skirmish line." The men dismounted, boots striking dry earth, carbines raised. They spread out along the ridgeline, their movements practiced, disciplined. The air grew thick with anticipation, the silence before the storm. Custer remained on his horse, his expression unreadable. And then the first shot rang out. A single crack, sharp against the stillness. Then another, and another. And then, all at once, the world exploded. The warriors came like a flood, their ponies kicking up dust, their war cries slicing through the air. Bullets snapped through the grass, arrows hissed overhead. The first line of soldiers fired, their carbines belching smoke and lead, but it was not enough. The warriors did not slow. They came faster, their faces painted in streaks of red and black, feathers whipping in the wind. Custer's men fought to hold the ridge, but the line was already breaking. Some of the horses, spooked by the gunfire, reared and bolted. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, fumbled with his rifle, his hands shaking. He fired blindly, his shot going wide. A warrior closed the distance in an instant, a club crashing against the soldier's skull, sending him crumpling to the ground. A lieutenant shouted, trying to rally the men, but his words were swallowed by the chaos. Another wave of warriors surged forward, and the skirmish line collapsed. Custer's horse danced beneath him, nostrils flared, sensing the panic. He pulled hard on the reins, scanning the battlefield. Reno's column should have been here by now. Benteen, too. But there was no sign of them. They were alone. Mitch Boyer, still in the saddle beside him, turned, His dark eyes filled with something Custer had never seen in him before. Fear. "We have to move," Boyer said. "Now." Custer hesitated. Retreat was not in his nature. He had built his legend on boldness, on never backing down. But this was something else. The warriors were everywhere, coming from all sides. There was no order, no discipline, only chaos and blood. Then he saw him, a figure among the charging warriors, a man with long black hair, bare-chested, riding a paint horse as if he was part of it. His eyes locked onto Custer's, just for a moment. Crazy Horse. The name whispered through Custer's mind like a breath of wind. And then the moment was gone, swallowed by the fury of battle. A soldier screamed. A horse collapsed, dragging its rider down with it. The line had disintegrated. There was no strategy now, no maneuvering. It was every man for himself. Custer wheeled his horse, shouting to the survivors, "Fall back." To the ridge. They ran, scrambling up the hill, dragging their wounded with them, desperate to escape the encircling warriors. Some never made it. Others, too panicked to reload, fought with the butts of their rifles, swinging wildly until they, too, were cut down. By the time they reached the top of the ridge, only a handful remained. Custer's breath came in ragged gasps. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears. His men formed a tight cluster around him, rifles raised, their faces streaked with sweat and blood. Below them, the warriors were regrouping. Custer tightened his grip on his revolver. This was not the battle he had expected. This was not the fight he had planned. And for the first time in his life, George Armstrong Custer knew what it felt like to be hunted. The road to war had been paved long before Custer, and his men crested the ridge at Little Bighorn. It had begun years earlier, in the winter councils of Lakota, in the polished halls of Washington, in the dreams of men who saw the West as theirs to take. It had begun with the treaties, with the promises made and broken, with the slow tightening of the noose around the great free plains. And it had begun, most of all, with gold. The Black Hills were sacred. To the Lakota, they were the heart of the world, the center of creation, where the spirits of ancestors lingered in the wind. But to the men who rode west with their picks and shovels, they were something else entirely. In 1874, Custer himself had led an expedition into the hills, a survey mission under the banner of discovery. What they found there changed everything. Gold, rich and plentiful, glinting in the cold mountain streams. Word spread fast, faster than the government could contain it. By the next year, miners were flooding into the hills, staking claims, carving roads, ignoring the treaty that said this land belonged to the Lakota. Sitting Bull had seen it coming. He had dreamed of it. In his visions, he had seen soldiers falling like rain, their bodies littering the ground, the blue of their uniforms swallowed by the dust. He had warned his people, and they had listened. They had prepared. As the intrusions into their land grew bolder, so did their resistance. By the spring of 1876, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had gathered in numbers not seen in a generation. They had no choice. This was their last stand. The United States government called it an uprising. The generals in Washington called it insubordination. The order went out. All Indians not on the reservation by January 31st would be considered hostile. There was no attempt to negotiate, no willingness to understand. The army was sent to enforce the order, and at the head of that army rode Custer. He had always been reckless. It was what had made him famous. During the Civil War, he had been the Golden Boy, the youngest general in the Union Army, charging headlong into battle with his long curls flying, his saber flashing. He had thrived in chaos, turning near defeats into stunning victories through sheer audacity. His legend had been built on it. But this war was different. The plains were not the battlefields of Virginia. His enemy did not fight by the rules of West Point. They did not stand in ranks, waiting for the bugle to call the charge. They moved like the wind, striking and vanishing, leaving no trace but the blood in the grass. And Custer, for all his brilliance, refused to understand that. His orders had been simple. Find the Lakota and force them onto the reservations. He had been given the 7th Cavalry, nearly 600 men, veterans of the frontier wars. He had been told to wait for reinforcements, to move carefully. But Custer did not wait. He never waited. He wanted a victory, one that would cement his place in history, one that would silence the whispers that he had been too bold, too hungry for glory. He had ignored his scouts. They had told him the truth, but it was not a truth he wanted to hear. Mitch Boyer had ridden at his side for years. He had seen battle, had learned to read the land, to read the signs. When he told Custer that they were outnumbered, that the village ahead was larger than any they had faced before, he was not guessing. He knew. But Custer would not believe it. He had faced these warriors before at Washita, when he had struck their winter camp and slaughtered them in their sleep. He had seen them flee before him. He expected them to do the same now. That was his first mistake. His second was dividing his forces. He had done it to move faster, to strike from multiple angles. It was a tactic that had served him well in the past. But here, in this land, against this enemy, it was suicide. Major Reno was sent to attack the village from the south. Captain Benteen was ordered to scout ahead. Custer took his own column, believing they would all converge in a decisive blow. But Reno's charge failed. The warriors did not run. They turned, they fought, and Reno, caught in the open, panicked. He ordered a retreat to the bluffs, leaving his men scrambling for their lives. Benteen, when he received Custer's desperate message, "Come quick, bring packs," did not ride to his aid. He held his ground, waiting. And Custer, leading his column forward, rode straight into the trap. The battle was already lost before the first shot was fired. The land had betrayed him. The valley that had seemed open and welcoming had closed around him, the hills rolling inward, trapping his men in their folds. The river, which had shimmered so invitingly in the distance, was now a barrier, cutting off retreat. The warriors had waited, hidden in the coulees, in the folds of the land. They had let him come, and then they had struck. The charge had come all at once, a roar of hoofbeats and gunfire, war cries rising over the din. The soldiers, caught in the open, had no cover. They fired blindly, their bullets cutting through smoke and dust, but the warriors kept coming. Crazy Horse led them, his war paint streaked across his face, his voice ringing out over the battlefield. He did not lead with commands. He led with action. He rode straight through the fire, untouched, as if the bullets could not find him. Custer's men fought, but they were fighting against ghosts. The warriors disappeared into the dust, only to reappear at their flanks, striking from all sides. The soldiers fell in clusters, their bodies tumbling into the dry grass. The horses screamed, rearing and kicking, throwing riders to the ground. Custer had no plan now. His strategy had crumbled in the face of reality. He had underestimated them. He had believed the stories, the myths that painted the native warriors as savages with no discipline, no tactics. That was his third mistake. His men tried to form a line, to make a stand, but it was no use. The battle had already become a massacre. They had no more bullets, no more time. The warriors closed in, tightening the circle. And Custer, for the first time in his life, realized that there was no escape. He looked around at his men, saw the fear in their faces. He had led them here. He had promised them victory. He had given them death instead. The sun was high now, the heat pressing down like a weight. The cries of the dying filled the air. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder, of blood. Custer drew his pistol, but he knew it was useless. This was the end. And yet, he could not bring himself to believe it. The ridge was a death trap. The soldiers of the 7th Cavalry had clustered there in the last moments of their retreat, their backs to the dry, brittle grass, their hands shaking as they reloaded what few rounds they had left. Their blue uniforms, caked in sweat and dust, stood in stark contrast to the land around them. The sun was merciless, baking the battlefield, turning the blood in the dirt into dark, cracked patches. They were surrounded. Everywhere Custer looked, warriors moved with deadly precision, darting between the hills, riding through the smoke like phantoms. This was not the desperate, heroic last stand that the papers would later claim. This was chaos, panic, the complete collapse of order. Custer still held his revolver, but he had long since stopped barking orders. There was nothing left to command. He watched as his men fought in fragments, broken pockets of resistance scattered across the slope. Some crouched behind the bodies of their fallen comrades, desperately trying to find cover where there was none. Others had dropped their rifles entirely, swinging their sabers like madmen, hacking wildly at the shadows closing in. A soldier to his right, a young man, barely more than a boy, fired his last round and fumbled at his belt for more. His fingers found only emptiness. His breath hitched in his throat. He turned to Custer, eyes wide, searching for instruction. But there was nothing left to say. Then the boy was gone, yanked backward off his feet by a warrior on horseback, his body disappearing into the dust. Custer did not see where he fell. The cavalry had always believed in their firepower, their ability to outgun any enemy. But this was not a battle of guns. The warriors fought with more than bullets. They fought with movement, with precision, with an understanding of this land that the soldiers would never possess. Arrows filled the air, cutting down those who hesitated, slicing through cloth and flesh. Lances struck like lightning, silent and final. Some of the troopers tried to run. They stumbled down the slopes, desperate to reach the river, but they never made it far. Warriors overtook them in moments, cutting them down with tomahawks and clubs. The screams rose and fell, swallowed by the wind. Custer turned, searching for familiar faces among the carnage. Mitch Boyer had been here moments ago, his most trusted scout, the one man who had seen this disaster coming before anyone else. But Boyer was gone. Maybe he had fallen. Maybe he had slipped away in the chaos, disappearing into the land the way the Lakota always did. Or maybe he had accepted what Custer himself still could not. The soldiers who remained huddled together now, their backs pressed against one another. Their hands shook as they tried to reload, fingers slipping, dropping cartridges into the dirt. A few had given up entirely, drawing their revolvers instead, knowing they would only get 6 more chances. Custer looked down at his own pistol, the polished grip warm from the sun. He had fired 3 rounds already. That left 3 more. He clenched his jaw. The warriors had slowed now, circling like wolves, watching. The end was close. They knew it. Custer's men knew it. The fear was palpable, thick in the air, the scent of sweat and gunpowder mixing with something deeper, something final. A moment of silence fell over the ridge, just for a breath. The world seemed to hold still. Then, from the dust, a lone figure emerged. Crazy Horse. He rode without hesitation, bare-chested, his body streaked with war paint, his black hair flowing in the wind. His horse moved like an extension of himself, hooves barely touching the ground. He did not slow. He did not need to. The warriors followed. The final charge came in a wave of fury, of movement too fast to track. The soldiers fired their last rounds, the reports of their pistols sharp against the afternoon air. But it did not matter. One by one they fell. Some fought to the end, swinging their empty rifles like clubs, screaming curses into the dust. Others dropped to their knees, hands raised in surrender, only to be struck down seconds later. Custer saw it all, yet it barely registered. His world had narrowed to the beat of his own heart, the dry wind against his skin, the weight of his revolver in his palm. He took a breath. He raised the pistol. And then he was gone. No one knew exactly how he fell. There were no surviving soldiers to tell the story. The newspapers would later craft their version of it, a noble last stand, a fearless leader fighting to the last man, his body surrounded by his faithful troopers. But the truth was much simpler. There had been no final charge, no glorious resistance, only chaos, and then silence. The battlefield belonged to the victors now. The Lakota and Cheyenne moved among the fallen, collecting weapons, retrieving arrows, tending to their wounded. The soldiers' bodies lay where they had fallen, stripped of their uniforms, their boots, their weapons. It was not done out of cruelty. It was the way of war, the way it had always been. Above them, the raven that had circled the ridge before the battle still lingered, watching. The wind had shifted now, carrying the scent of blood, of spent gunpowder, of something irreversible. By the time the sun began to set, the last traces of the battle were fading into the land itself. The dust settled. The river ran quietly in the distance. The ridge stood as it always had, as it always would. Custer was gone. His legend had only just begun. The sun hung low over the plains, bleeding its last light across the battlefield. The heat of the day had finally broken, leaving only the scent of dust, blood, and gunpowder clinging to the air. The warriors moved among the dead, silent now, their victory complete. They did not revel in the slaughter, nor did they celebrate. War was not about glory. It was about survival. And on this day, they had survived. The bodies of Custer and his men lay where they had fallen, scattered across the ridge like discarded chess pieces. They had fought, but not bravely. They had died, but not well. The final moments had been chaos, a storm of screaming horses, cracking rifles, and dull, what impacts as clubs and lances found their marks. There had been no last stand, no desperate heroics, only fear and the inevitable crush of death. Sitting Bull stood at the edge of the battlefield, his gaze heavy as he looked out over the fallen soldiers. He had not fought in the battle. His role was not to strike the enemy, but to guide his people. His vision had foretold this moment, the blue-coated men falling like rain, their bodies swallowed by the land they had tried to claim. The Great Spirit had shown him the path, but even now, standing among the dead, he knew that victory here would not be enough. The war was far from over. Crazy Horse was among the warriors gathering weapons, his face unreadable, his body streaked with the dried blood of battle. He had led the charge, striking fear into the hearts of men who had believed themselves untouchable. But there was no triumph in his expression. He knew what was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The Wasatchew would not accept this defeat. They would come back, stronger, angrier, more ruthless than before. The village began to move before the first stars appeared in the sky. They would not wait for the army's retaliation. They had won a great battle, but they would not stand still and let the weight of it crush them. The women packed quickly, the children quiet with understanding. This was the way of things. You fought, you won, and then you left before the next wave came. By morning, the battlefield was empty, save for the dead. 3 days later, the first of the soldiers arrived. They came in grim silence, the stink of death thick in the air. They had expected to find survivors, wounded men holding out against the odds. Instead, they found a graveyard. The bodies of Custer's men had been stripped of their weapons, their uniforms taken, their boots missing. Some had been mutilated, not out of cruelty, but as part of the warrior tradition, to prevent their spirits from returning to seek revenge. It was an old belief, one the soldiers did not understand. To them, it was savagery. Custer lay among them, his golden hair matted with dust and blood. His body was untouched, save for a bullet wound to the chest and another to the temple. A quiet death compared to the others. His men had suffered far worse. The news spread fast. The mighty General Custer, the Indian fighter, the hero of the Civil War, was dead. Slaughtered. Humiliated. It could not be. The newspapers would not allow it. The country would not allow it. He had been a hero, and heroes did not die like this. The lie was born before the bodies were even buried. The first reports painted a picture of courage, of resistance, of an honorable last stand against impossible odds. The truth that Custer had led his men into a massacre of his own making was buried beneath the weight of myth-making. The public did not want to hear of failure. They wanted valor. They wanted defiance. They wanted Custer, gun in hand, standing against the tide until the very last breath. The newspapers obliged. They called it Custer's last stand, a glorious fight to the death. They spoke of the savage enemy, the overwhelming numbers, the brave soldiers who fought to the end. They did not speak of Custer's arrogance, of his refusal to wait for reinforcements, of his dismissal of his scouts' warnings. They did not speak of the men who had tried to flee, who had died with their backs turned, shot down as they ran. They did not speak of the truth. The government seized upon the story. twisting it into something useful. Custer's death became a rallying cry. Revenge was demanded. The defeat at Little Bighorn was not seen as a sign of Lakota and Cheyenne strength, but as an insult that had to be answered with blood. And answer it they did. Within a year, the Great Resistance was crushed. The army descended upon the plains with relentless force. The buffalo herds were slaughtered, their bodies left to rot beneath the sun, their bones bleaching white in the grass. The people starved, their way of life cut out from under them like a rug pulled from beneath their feet. The reservations swallowed them whole, and those who refused to go, those who fought, were hunted down one by one. Crazy Horse was killed less than a year later, stabbed in the back while in army custody. Sitting Bull held on longer, watching as his people were forced into submission, as their lands were taken piece by piece. He was murdered in 1890, shot by Indian police in his own camp. His death just another footnote in the long march of history. Custer, however, lived on, not in flesh, but in legend, in bronze statues and oil paintings, in history books that told only one side of the story. His name became immortal, a symbol of American heroism, of manifest destiny, of the unshakable will to conquer the frontier. The truth was buried beneath marble memorials. And yet, for those who knew, for those who had seen the battle with their own eyes, the lie never sat right. The land remembered. The ridge where Custer fell did not forget. The wind still carried the echoes of that day, the gunfire, the screams, the final moments of men who had believed they could not be beaten. History belonged to those who wrote it. But the truth? The truth would always belong to the land.